Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about a watch which is not very well known by a large number of people, but it's a watch which comes from a brand which is remaking a brand from the mid-20th century, which had quite an important role, you could say, with Heuer in terms of selling rebranded models of their watches, and also working with other brands as well. And so they were known for producing these very interesting tonneau-style cased watches with chronographs and a number of very sporty appearances. Now, the brand has been resurrected after the quartz crisis, like so many others you could say, but the quality they're providing here, the finishing and the care to put an impressive sort of movement inside, really does show a new competitor on this marketplace of the £1,000 to £1,500 price range for a chronograph, with quality which keeps up with the likes of Longines, for example, very, very well, and I think presents something very interesting and very new on the market at a time when we're really desperately in need of high-quality watches with some complication for a reasonable price and one which is currently accessible as watch prices go up. But more on that as I explain this watch. But before I begin this video, I would like to make the statement that this watch has been lent to me very kindly for the purposes of this video in this review by Page & Cooper. And Page & Cooper is a seller of watches in the UK focusing on smaller brands, and I've bought several watches from them in the past, such as my Zin 104, as well as an Autodromo a few years ago. And they've always been really excellent with me and have become real friends of the channel. I've featured on their YouTube channel, which was an inspiration in itself for this channel, and really it's always a pleasure to work with them. So they've very kindly provided this watch for the purposes of the review, which they've lent to me for a period, just to be able to get to see and to get a feel of, bearing in mind that I was impressed by it when I saw it in person whilst visiting them. And so that really is the background of this review, which I think is important for full disclosure. And before I begin this video, I would of course like to encourage you to like, share and subscribe if you enjoy this video or find its content useful or helpful when you're looking around watches, purchasing a watch, or simply to learn a little bit more. Also, do follow me on Instagram at the address which is now on the screen to be able to access content which otherwise you wouldn't see here on the channel, such as meeting with individuals, seeing new watches in the wild, or simply other content which simply wouldn't fit into a YouTube video. So do follow me there at the address which is now on the screen. Before speaking directly about this watch, I would like to just note Le Jour's history, because they're a brand which went bust during the quartz crisis, but previously were an exporting agency for a number of brands as rebranded watches. So, for example, they worked with Heuer, and so you can get a lot of Heuer watches which are identical to other Heuers, but branded Le Jour. And it was a brand which produced these watches and was quite successful in this, but did go bust during the quartz crisis, perhaps unsurprisingly, because so many brands did. However, as this new watch has been reformed, so it's a resurrected brand, you could say, this watch doesn't have quite the same history in that regard. However, I don't think this is too much of a problem, because what this brand offers is something which slots into the market very conveniently to provide something which is of higher quality than I've seen previously at this sort of price range, and with a design which I, as a Speedmaster Mark III owner, naturally find very, very appealing. But only because the quality is there, and I do state that very clearly. I don't review watches which I don't find interesting or add something to the channel speaking about them, and this watch certainly does. Now, the watch comes in stainless steel and comes with two different case finishes, as well as an additional finish if you want it, because they come either with this particular finish, which I must admit I rather like. It has this sunburst effect to the steel, as well as this raised bezel, as you can see, in polished steel, and these brushed sides. And the quality of the finishing is really very, very good, as well as these polished bevels, as you can see, and nicely embossed caseback, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. As well as that, you do get this crown, which is deeply engraved with the Le Jour logo, which I think is nicely designed, as well as having this matted under area around it, and these polished pushers. There is also a version which comes with a bead-blasted case, so it's entirely bead-blasted with the same design, or indeed the fully bead-blasted case with a further black PVD coating to give it a blacked-out look, which is rather a nice aspect, because owning one of the original watches from the period with that finish would be really impossible, because the finishes are so fragile on those older watches that you could practically remove them with a fingernail. But with a modern PVD application, you of course get much greater durability. And the dimensions of the case offer you a 42.5mm width by 46.3mm from lug to lug, and 16mm in thickness, although it feels a heck of a lot thinner than that because of the shape of the caseback and because of the way the bracelet hangs. But the design is not dissimilar to something you might have seen on something like an Omega Speedmaster Mark IV, with this particular shape, and I think it looks fantastic and quintessentially 70s. But one aspect of this watch which is perhaps unexpected is the fact that it has a screw-down crown and a 200-metre water resistance, so it is a viable choice as a multi-purpose sports watch to be used while swimming or diving as well, which is great to see, although of course without a bezel that's not its primary function. But it's always nice to see this sort of innovation going into a watch. On the front of the watch one sees a sapphire crystal, which is flat and has an anti-reflective coating, which goes blue as you can see, and really does help you be able to read this watch at pretty much any angle, thanks to that design. And as far as I understand it, this case is not produced in Switzerland, and is perhaps produced in the East. But considering the price of this watch, I think that's perfectly acceptable, because I'm not convinced you would be able to achieve this sort of quality in Switzerland for that price. And I think one has to be pragmatic about these things, which is why I'm being so clear about it, because I think it's important to note the fact that this quality is only achievable because of the suppliers this brand has. Inside you do still get a Valjoux movement, but I'll speak about that later on in the video. The dial of this watch is extremely well executed, and I've spent several hours looking at this watch under a loupe to be able to really understand the dial better before producing the review, and I really am convinced by the quality. The matted areas of the dial are extremely well designed and very, very well applied and printed, as well as the fact that the printing around the Jour logo, for example, is superb considering how fine that logo is where the printing is concerned. One also sees beveled edges around the day and date windows, allowing you to be able to see those very clearly, but still with an element of luxury. And then one has sunken subdials around these three vertically mounted subdials, which are of course key to the movement of this watch, and the application of luminova to the dial in those small boxes around the edge of the dial is faultless. So I really can't fault the quality here with the dial, which I think is excellent, and does give you a fantastically clear readout of the time as well as the chronograph function, if I just start that chronograph with this pusher. You do get full graduations between each marker as well, which is appreciated, as well as the fact that the hands are an aspect which I really do like, because one sees the fact that their tips are different angles on the hours as well as the minutes in relation to their length, which works very well from an aesthetic perspective, and I think the choice to have different colours for the chronograph and the time functions is very well chosen, as far as an aesthetic choice, but also a technical choice for the practicality of this watch. Of course, the dial does come in different versions depending upon the model you buy, and so there are different arrays and arrangements depending upon your case finishing, with different arrangements of black, grey and white, as well as some orange and even some brown tachymeters available if you happen to choose them. Now, for an increased price there is a meteorite dial too, but I must admit, unless you're particularly into that meteorite style, I personally don't see any need for it, when the finishing of the dial itself is already very, very good. And this is why I find this watch impressive, because whilst perhaps it doesn't have the same reputation as other brands because of the fact that it's a resurrected brand, and one which hasn't existed for many years, the quality is indisputably very, very high, and on par with Longines, for example, as far as I can see with the quality of their dials and their finishing, which is very, very high praise for a new brand, and they certainly have done the brand justice by producing a watch of this standard and not cutting corners, which I think is very easy for a lot of upstarts to produce. And of course there are standout watches at every price range, but I haven't seen a watch with these specifications for this price with anything near this quality, making Longines perhaps the most obvious competitor to this watch, whereas an Oris chronograph will be more expensive, for instance, and of equivalent quality, which I think is interesting and quite surprising, because they have hit a very important area of the market. Now, looking at the build of this watch, you of course have this quite hefty top to the watch, so it's nice to see an appropriate bracelet matching it. And the bracelet is solid steel of the same variety and the same finishing to match, and as you can see fits into these tonneau style hooded lugs very, very well, without an end link as such, but rather simply this flat end bar. It does use push pins, which I think is an element which would be nice to see as having screw pins, because they are easier to size. But it's not the be all and end all for me, certainly in terms of this watch. Although of course it would be nice to see that. That being said, though, the tapering of the bracelet is extremely well executed, and not something you normally see at this price range being done with quite such care and elegance, with so many links allowing that subtle tapering of the bracelet down from the end of the lug to the clasp itself, which is nice to have at a narrower size, just to give further elegance to the watch. There are these polished edges, as you can see, to the bracelet, which are done very, very well and to the same standard as the case, and they are solid links, so they're not folded, so they won't stretch over time. They will remain firmly the same size. The clasp itself is also very well finished, and finished with that same fine graining as the case of the watch, and has this double pusher deployment system with a solid arm. And so it's very much what you would expect, but still done to a very good standard, which is what I would expect for the price, bearing in mind the fact that this brand has done such a good job with the dial and the case itself. Now, of course, the movement is a major concern with these watches, and they've chosen the very standard choice of the ETA Valjoux 7750. And it's a good choice for this price because it's an automatic chronograph movement made in Switzerland of a very high standard, and is for many the most successful chronograph movement ever made, because it's been made for many years, refined, and now is a very, very serviceable movement with brilliant standards in terms of design, and one which is put together very well and regulated well, will last you for many years to come, which is the case with this watch. You do, of course, get the day-date function there, as well as this vertical orientation of the chronograph subdials, which I think work very well to pack as much information onto the dial as possible, and are exactly what I would expect for this price range. And that gives you a 46-hour power reserve and runs at 4 Hz, with, of course, hacking and hand winding from the crown, as well as automatic winding too. So it really is the best of both worlds as far as affordability and reliability, but also being able to have a mechanical chronograph too. I think this watch also should be considered within the wider market for watches at the moment, because at the moment we're seeing a period of really radical change in the industry. Because at this point it's no longer cost effective to have a lot of watches or brands which have existed for a long period of time in their current form. For example, Omega are gradually adding coaxial escapements to all of their watches, which I would assume is a precursor to increasing their prices. Likewise, one sees a number of other brands such as Zinn with extremely long waiting lists because of the fact that their watches take a long time to produce, as well as having a small team operating around the clock to produce good quality watches. And so as these waiting times extend for months and months, prices in the watch industry are inevitably going to start increasing. And so having brands like this which are able to produce a really high quality watch from the standpoint of the finishing, of the build, of the movement, it really is a blessing for those who want a more affordable watch, but still one which competes with the bigger players in the industry, such as, for instance, Longines, which I've mentioned in this video. And even brands like Oris, for example, are offering quite high price ranges for some of their chronographs. For instance, the Oris Diver 65 chronograph is certainly not a cheap watch. It's one which you really have to think about with regards to the amount of money spent on it. And so I think having a watch at this price range with these specs is very impressive, and I think demonstrates a lot of hope for the future for this particular brand. And so here is the watch in the dark, and as you can see, the C3 Superluminova on this watch works very, very well. Certainly it does the job in terms of giving you a very bright and vivid display of the time at night. Of course, because of the dial orientation and layout, you don't get a different marker for 12 o'clock, which some people would argue is a bit of an inconvenience to be able to tell which way up the watch is. Although, bearing in mind that you have a larger marker at 3 o'clock, you are very quickly able to orientate it at night. Now, the Lume longevity is rather long at 5 or 6 hours, and very much an impressive aspect considering the fact there isn't very much lume on the dial, when you look at the fact that the markers at each quadrant of the dial, which are rather small, you could say, because of the presence of subdials as well as the date. You also see a large amount of lume on the hands, and so only the time is displayed at night, but really that's all you'd want, considering the fact that having lume on everything would simply clutter up the watch. So I think for the price it's a very impressive lume display, and there's of course C3 Superluminova giving you this green glow. And here is the watch on my 7-inch wrist, and you can see the watch fits very comfortably. Now, the one aspect of this watch which is a little bit of an inconvenience is the sheer weight of it, because it is a heavier watch because of the sheer mass of steel of it. However, because the fact the case is domed, and the fact that the bracelet itself is quite heavy, it actually stabilises quite well on the wrist, and you'll notice that the crown is recessed into the case whilst also being a screw-down crown, and this helps the crown, despite not being guarded, to not dig into the wrist at all, depending upon your motion or your movement, and thus remains away from any sort of area of discomfort, which I think is appreciated. The design of the case, whilst tall, as I've said, sinks into the wrist, but thanks to those bevels on the bezel as well as the case flank, you are able to get a dress cuff over the watch without too much trouble, despite the tall height of the watch itself. So that is one area where Jour have innovated rather well to develop this to a high standard, and the bracelet doesn't trap hairs, and due to its bevel on the edge, doesn't pose any issue for tight style cuffs either, with that edge, as well as the fact that it is quite a low profile bracelet, perhaps also due to that use of those pins rather than screws within the bracelet itself. And so, as I get to this stage of the video, I would like to conclude the video with the comment, this watch is something which caught my eye. Certainly speaking with Page & Cooper a little while ago, I was impressed by the quality of the watch, and handling it, I must say I was surprised that a brand was able to provide this for the price, which I think is important considering the fact that there are always concerns with regards to what brands can offer. At any price range it could be said, but especially at this particular moment in time, when we are reaching a state of change in the industry. And so I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say about this watch, because it certainly is an acquired taste, but I think they really have done a very good job of quality here, and the QC on this watch, or the quality control, is excellent. I've noticed that there really is nothing to fault here, which is rare with a watch of this price from a brand which is relatively young. And so if you enjoyed this video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Sam on the Watch Guy, out.